at WFPR.FM. Thanks for being with us.
Hello and welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim and Mark. How are you this week, Mark?
Everything is great, Kim, and yourself?
Good. Everything's fine. You know, it's always good to get together and chat wine and food. And this week's show, we're actually going to talk a lot about restaurants and wine in restaurants and wines and wine tastings that sometimes can be in a restaurant and various things about dining and what you should do if you are out when you order some wine and how the industry right now and the state of the world is impacting restaurants and wine.
Yeah, things are changing, as you know, Kim, which we'll talk about, and I'll be hitting you with a lot of questions since you had worked in the wine industry a lot. So what was the first article you'd like to start with?
So the first article that we have is about ordering wine in a restaurant. And should you order by the bottle?
What would that be?
It being 7 o'clock, I'll call what is today, the 9th of November's meeting to order. Do we have any public comments? I see no one on Zoom, and the usual suspects in the lounge.
Don't dismiss the town council chambers. They're here live and present on Zoom.
You wish it was a lounge.
Yeah, maybe later, Steve, later. The hang time.
Hang tie. I knew he was going to do hang tie.
We need approval of the expansive minutes from the October 26th meeting. They're on your desk. Can I get a motion to approve?
Motion to approve. Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We don't need roll calls tonight. Chuna is not on that I can see.
She's not.
Mr. Helen, the FY '23 operating budget adjustments.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I hope everybody had a chance to read through the packet.
I did.
For those that are watching at home live on Franklin TV, just go to the town calendar, franklinma.gov, town website, and you'll get all the materials. Really quickly, the first page of the memo goes through many points that I think many of us are aware of, but I did add in the back, just for some referential material, some of the latest economic conditions out there from a statewide and federal perspective. I just added in, I said in the fiscal forecast over the summer, I was going to add in an update. There's really nothing more to add. And so I just did a quick update generally about regarding the general economic conditions. Before we dive into the budget amendments, I did add in to that same point, I did add in the receipts received through September 30th, which is kind of our quarter one, July, August, and September. And the germane number that folks should look at is in the percent collected column. If you look at the aggregate of the general fund, you'll see 25.9%. So we're just a little under 1% over where we projected. As usual, some of the categories ebb and flow because these are largely revenue sources that are based on human behaviors. Obviously, the big enchilada is up top, the motor vehicle excise. And so folks just have to caution the cold weather's coming up. Maybe people aren't using hotels as much. Maybe they don't go out to eat as often and consume things. And so some of those revenues may be a little buffed up because it was summer or fall. And just like we do with human behavior, we go where we want, when we want during the whole year. But generally what we try to look at is that aggregate because some are underperforming, some are overperforming. And so you look at the aggregate of the local receipts and you look at the 2023 budget is $10,921,251 is the number we had estimated, and we're now at about 2.8 million. As long as the motor vehicle excise tax comes in, those numbers should look pretty good by the time we get in March. Barring any major other unforeseen circumstances, which there could be some based on what's happening these days, everything looks pretty good from a local receipts perspective. And so with that as kind of a backdrop, tonight, many of you know from previous years, but just for the folks watching at home and some of the newer folks, if you live in a small town, typically you have a town meeting in the spring, and oftentimes most communities have a town meeting in the fall, or what's called a special town meeting. This is kind of the same thing that we do here, we just have a different form of government. This is our kind of special town meeting. Why do towns do financial matters oftentimes in the fall? Because the state budget is complete. We have better revenue projections, again, like I just said, based off the Q1 local receipts. And we can kind of recalibrate and see where all the expenses are. In the case of this, and I'll go through it in a minute, some of the expense line items when we get into May as well are all projections like debt service or health insurance and some other accounts. And so when we get to the fall, towns traditionally, by law, have to finalize their FY20, in this case, their fiscal year budget prior to the tax rate setting, which is required by state law to be done, early in December. So this year we'll be doing our tax rate hearing. Shameless plug, just for Kevin Doyle after he came to the last one. That's his Super Bowl for sure. And for those of you that want to learn more about assessing and tax rates and how we get there, that'll be on November 30th. We just posted the legal ad today. So if folks look on the second page of the memo, you'll see I try to break things out between revenue adjustments and expense adjustments. So the main revenues that will be adjusted are the assessors have certified and will be filing for an increase in revenue over what we projected in the spring by $271,000 in new growth. We learned all about new growth at the last meeting, so everybody should know exactly what new growth is. And then the second piece is the additional revenues in local receipts. This is very complicated. We'll go through in the revenue sheet in a moment if folks want, but the host community agreements and the opioid settlement money have shifted those numbers a little bit based on the changes in state law over the summer. And the town has received its first two smaller installments of opioid, settlement money, which the town expects for 20 years. The amounts that we were told we were getting were not on we have a spreadsheet the Attorney General sent us with every single payment. I will say the payments we got did not add up to what was in the spreadsheet, but that's okay because eventually the town will be creating a stabilization account, which is authorized under the statute for all of the opioid settlement money. So eventually the opioid settlement money over the next year will be coming out of the budget like it is now, and will be actually be going into a whole separate statutory fund to deposit those cash. So it's basically like a piggy bank, if you will, for those watching at home and don't know what a stabilization account is. So those numbers in local receipts have switched just a tiny bit. And then finally, if you look at the third major category, which is called state aid assessments and other revenues, we saw approximately about a $290,000 increase in state aid. While that sounds good, and it is good, I also will caution folks that given the per pupil cost, and we'll go through this in the revenue sheet in a minute, the per pupil cost got doubled this year at the end of the legislative session, and some have asked me, well, why wasn't there a bigger amount of money? And you'll see when we get to the revenue sheet, the charter school dynamic, as well as the school choice and some of the other formulaic areas of Chapter 70, as we've said to this committee many, many times before. The Chapter 70 state aid formula, we are in the quote-unquote hold harmless section of that, where because of the significantly amount of declining enrollment the district has had from year to year over the last 15 years, we will never see, unless they pour, tens of billions of dollars more into the system, we are unlikely to see any massive amount of state aid increase that would amount to any significant revenue. So other communities did see, because of that per pupil increase, those districts did see some significant bumps, either if they were having huge enrollment numbers or they were underperforming schools. So neither of which is the case in Franklin. And then quickly in the expense adjustments, my budget is not going up in the expense item in the town administrator's line item because of some big, huge increase. That's where the cannabis fees and the opioid settlement money will be, so that we can pay out those contracts to those vendors, particularly the Safe Coalition, on that. The elections line item, we did do a quick amount of money, about $15,000, due to the new laws around early voting and mail-in voting. So made a small adjustment there. I did note the library on here because folks may see a $75,000 deduction on expenses, $75,000 into personnel. The library, many of you remember the MAR. I still don't remember what that acronym is. I think it's minimum something requirement. The MAR is a state library formula, and for years we were on a wait list. We didn't hit it. We've had a commitment to that for 5 years. We've hit MAR, and so as a result, the library has a little bit more expense money than they need. So for collective bargaining, we're just moving the expense money for the increases from collective bargaining into personnel, so it's just an easy shift of resources. The largest increase in the budget in this proposal tonight is in the debt and interest category. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's about $225,000. As I mentioned a moment ago, the debt and interest from the borrowing earlier this spring, we now actually have those numbers, and that's why we come back and adjust the numbers in the fall to meet reality. And so there's an increase there from the borrowing for the Horace Mann drainage project, as well as the interior municipal building renovation project. And then finally, some folks will say, well, the numbers don't add up. That's true. The additional revenue, the extra couple $100,000 that's kind of lingering out there in people's math, what we would have done if that extra state aid or some of the new growth didn't come in, the comp reserve line item would have been reduced. That's that amount. But seeing as how there's a little extra revenue that's there, we're going to leave the extra revenue, or the proposals to leave it under comp reserve for the typical reasons, which are usually unforeseen personnel decisions, retirement costs, which we have had a couple of unannounced retirements just over the last month. And with the labor shortage of people coming and going, having that there certainly helps the town with recruitment and retention. In additional collective bargaining, there is one contract that is still outstanding. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I anticipate hopefully in January or February, your meeting will have an overview of hopefully our completed compensation and classification plan. And so it's a little bit of an extra cushion there. And just so that the public knows, if any unspent monies in that account or any account in the entire budget, any unspent monies at the end of the fiscal year, that is what rolls into what's called our free cash pool, which for many of you that have been on the committee, that's where we do our annual capital plan from. The free cash each year is where we derive the capital plan for facilities upgrades, dump trucks, police cruisers, fire trucks, all that other stuff. So that's an overview of the memo. The resolution that you have in front of you does show a bunch of transfers. They're smaller amounts. All of those transfers, other than the ones that I just mentioned, are being transferred out of comp reserve, and you'll notice down in the line item 910 in benefits, a deduction of $430,000. All of that money is being proposed to be transferred into the actual personnel budgets of the departments that reflect the collective bargaining agreements that have been completed. All of the municipal collective bargaining agreements have been completed with the exception of one, and we hope to have that completed by the end of the calendar year. So I'll stop there, and before I go on to the revenue or control sheet, Mr. Chairman, and just ask if anybody has any questions.
Questions? Anybody?
I do kind of, but I don't know if it goes into the control sheet, of just kind of asking a little bit about that. So the 700,000, that was the compensation reserve. That was kind of just the bogey that was out there because it's like CBA hasn't happened, all of that, right? Okay. And then we bumped it down, I get, because now it's actually flowed out. Which, how many years is the CBA negotiated for?
They're for 3 years.
3 years, okay. Okay, so right now there's 270 left, which I know is a little control sheet. So that's a little higher than in the past, but it kind of gives you a nice reserve, and then probably, if history repeats itself, that'll come down as any other adjustments happen.
That's exactly right. So usually the amount in that is about 100 to 150,000. I can't remember off the top of my head, but generally in that ballpark. So in off collective bargaining years, that account is significantly lower than what it is. In collective bargaining years, if you go back the last 15, 20 years, that's where you have those revenues to be able to pay for the collective bargaining agreements, that you're not going to finalize, well into the fiscal year. So it's kind of like projecting out as best you can.
Yeah, okay, and I remember that from when we went through the line items. Okay, that makes sense. That was in mind.
Anybody else? I have some. The excise billing, because that's way low, is that like in February, March?
Yes.
So we get a commitment from the state or something that time?
Name and address? No, just kidding.
Huh?
Just kidding.
Hi. Through you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, so the motor vehicle gets mailed, the first commitment gets mailed out in February and is due in March. And it's the largest, usually is the first one, which is usually over 30,000 bills are mailed at one time.
Okay.
So think of excise not as a fiscal year, but a calendar year, which is really confusing.
We went through this last time, why fiscal versus, okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Free cash, when does that start happening that you mentioned?
We just got it certified yesterday.
And was it way up or way down
It's
from last?
4.3 million, which is pretty equal to last year. But we'll see in a couple years whether my prediction is correct or not. With so much transition happening within the departments, with contracts, with services, over the last couple years due to the pandemic, if you notice state revenues were so high, they're cutting $3 billion worth back to taxpayers. I think that we're in a cycle, a 3 or 4 year cycle due to the economics of the pandemic. Traditionally, as you know, Mr. Chairman, most free cash years, we were at 2.7 million, 3 million, sometimes as low as 2 million, 2.2 million. And so when you look at the 10-year average, I expect the last year and this year coming up to be anomalies. But, in the future, we'll see. I'm not sure.
When does capital start?
Pretty soon.
Pretty soon, yeah, all right. Have we gotten any ARPA money from the county?
Yes. We received 3.5 mil, we received half of our allotment. So our allotment was roughly 6.5 million from the county. Half of that we've applied for, and we've actually received it, which is about 3.25 million. 1.5 million was for stormwater, which was for the year's worth of work to bridge the gap between where we're at with the permit and when the utility fee gets set in this coming year, in FY24. And then another 1.5 million approximately was for the water main replacement plan for last year. We're probably going to put in another $1 million worth of water main replacement to the county within the next few months. And then the third appropriation we just received a month ago, which was $250,000 for a 3-year commitment from Advocates, Inc. to have a second mental health clinician on the police department to do opposite hours and weekends so that there's a greater coverage. So hopefully we can get back on track. And before the pandemic, the mental health clinician, for those of you that are familiar with the program, is jail diversion grant for 10 years we got from the police department. We have a licensed mental health clinician on the police department that actually goes out with our officers on calls, and the goal is to try to get an individual lined up and acclimated to services. So 1, we can prevent the repeated calls to that address. 2, we can get the people the help that they need. And also 3, it reduces emergency room visits in the ambulance. All 3 of those, the return on investment is surreal compared to what we actually pay. All of this is through grant funding. The chief and I had a plan at some point that we would try to get those folks on actual staff, but right now, the community will have a second mental health clinician for the next 3 years. So that was $250,000. The county just announced at this meeting, actually at the council meeting a month ago, when they were here, that that they had just opened up the next 25%. So now towns are not eligible for 50% of their money; they're eligible for 75%. And shocking to me, I couldn't believe this. There is now, the county has 170 million, and they've now authorized 75% of that to be spent or applied for, and only like a tiny fraction of the communities have actually applied and got their money. And so we're way ahead of the curve on this stuff. And number two, the commissioners said when they were here that due to the federal regulations over ARPA money, if other towns don't start in calendar year 23, if they don't start applying for the money and start getting it with qualified projects, they're actually going to redistribute other towns' resources to other towns who are already using their money. So I'm sure you can see it in my eyes, right? Let's just keep going, right? And Congressman Auchincloss was here in the summer, and he gave the town 2 huge thumbs up and said that this was about as good of a community using the ARPA money as he has in his district for what it was intended to do. So I think the plan for the county money will stay the course with either sewer and water infrastructure throughout the community.
They take a percent, 3?
3%. 2.5% of the 3 is for all of the lawyers, consultants, accountants, online portals, and all that other stuff, basically administrative costs. And then 0.5% goes to our county projects. But presumably the courthouse, the Aggie, maybe their own programming that's eligible, some of the facilities, things of that sort.
Okay, one more question on that line. How many counties, we had 13 counties?
13 counties.
How many
Used to.
still operate? I know Norfolk does. I don't think Middlesex does.
I think it's less than a handful. I think Dukes County is still in effect on the Vineyard. I think Barnstable County is still in effect on the Cape. Bristol, Norfolk, Plymouth. I don't know if Suffolk County government exists anymore. And then there's Franklin Regional Council of Governments, which is called FERCOG, whole different system. They have no choice but to regionalize because there's very few people who live out there. There's like 30 towns in FERCOG. And I think Berkshire County still exists. So it's about maybe 5 or 6 of them. Middlesex is gone, Essex is gone. The big ones are gone.
All right. Question 1 yesterday is, do you anticipate that, see, because I think there was a little shell game on that, just a personal opinion. $2 billion was the anticipated take, but and it says education and transportation, if I remember correctly. But that doesn't mean that they can't reduce what they would normally have given in the budget process. So this year we got whatever the chapter 70 stuff or whatever. They could lower that and then give us some of the money from the $2 billion. Am I correct in that assumption?
I think it all just goes right into the same pool. I don't think the ballot question had stringent percentages with how they were spending it, like 25% here, 25 there, 25 here, whatever. Ultimately, I believe the legislature put out at least some sort of objective, common goal towards I think transportation and education, if I'm not mistaken, were the vast, overwhelming majority of where they've committed the money. But I think how that gets spent, where it gets spent, what problems they're solving, obviously is up to them on an annual basis. I don't think they're going to be deducting anything. It's just a guess. I don't think it's about shells moving one pot into another. I think it just goes right into the entire general revenue pool of the Commonwealth.
There's no requirement. I think that
I don't think they could.
I think the law said subject to appropriation.
Right.
The three key words.
Which is, right,
So-
which they have to do. I think if I recall the ballot question, this was supposed to be on the ballot like 6 years ago or 8 years ago. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe the Supreme Court or the Attorney General at the time rejected the constitutional amendment because of that issue. They couldn't put in the Constitution for some reason how they were going to spend the money, so it was just subject to appropriation of the legislature. It just formally passed, by the way. They just announced it like an hour ago.
Yeah, I saw it. That's what prompted the question.
Oh, okay.
I have a question. I looked through all of this, and you know what I don't see here is the school's revolving funds. Do they appear on our books somewhere?
They do not. So the school department has, I mean, you can ask them in December.
Oh, I will.
And, I'm sure there'll be many questions throughout the year of the revolving funds. But most school accounts are all etched in state law. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it conveniently, just to articulate. I mean, they basically operate under a separate set of laws in terms of municipal accounting. So they have a lot more leverage and flexibility to use their money than the municipal departments would.
Just because they don't.
It's
appear.
not on our, you can think of it like this, their revolving funds are equivalent to our local receipts, right? Their revolving funds are for fees, athletics, school transportation, yada, 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 right, all down the line. And so it's kind of similar to our meals tax, our building fees, our fire ambulance receipts. It's pretty comparable. But we have to report all that into this. They have their own set of reporting standards under the statutes.
Maybe they'll bring it in December.
I'll make sure they do. Just so that, Mr. Chairman, you don't have to go back and come back and, I'll ask him to bring a report.
I'm done, I think. Anybody else? I think the only thing left is that's just my rule, is to get a motion to, I'll make a motion that we approve the transfer of $542,000. Transfer is not the correct.
There's a resolution in the packet, I think, to raise and appropriate, transfer, and adjust the FY '23 budget. You see that
I move that we
down the bottom?
recommend to the council is a better word, I guess, to raise and appropriate, transfer, and adjust the FY '23 general fund individual appropriations in the amounts and to the accounts specified in the memo in total, and amount to an increase in the operating budget of $542,567. So moved.
Second.
Second, you did.
I did, yep.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Jim is still not there. Opposed? Anyone? That's it. 8 here. No, 7 here.
7.
Okay. Future agenda items beyond the school committee in December. Anyone? We've been through most every, other than our friends at the back of the room. I mean, we're gonna have to start recycling. We've been through DPW, police, fire. I don't think the building department has ever been in, building and inspections, that I remember.
You could have the permitting staff come in. I was going to suggest if there was you're also, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but probably 5 months away from everybody coming in for the budget hearings. If you want a comedy show, we can bring Brutus again for DPW, but I will say, Mr. Chairman, the compensation and classification plan from HR It's a pretty big deal. At some point, probably in January and February, we get that finished. That's a project that probably needs a deep dive. And then I think, yeah, I think it would be the senior center is coming to the council in December, because it'll be the 1 year, basically the 1 year anniversary of our new director and assistant director. So they could come in certainly later on if people are interested in that. And then the permitting staff, you're right, planning, health, inspections, passports, you know, all those folks down on the first floor. You could certainly have in, or the town clerk.
I think
I'm
it's
sure the
more-
town clerk wouldn't, she's probably not watching tonight, she's probably sleeping, but, you know.
I have a question for her. It's funny, I'm sure everybody voted. It was very slick getting in, the little thing, but going out, it was still a pile of paper that they had to flip through.
Yeah,
And that just boggled my mind.
yeah.
Well, they also had the little receipts that were printed out, so they knew you were you.
Huh?
That was new.
The receipts were new, yes.
Oh, yeah, the receipts,
were
yeah,
new.
yeah,
But somebody had to sit there and
yeah.
pages and pages. It was electronic on the inside, and paper going back out. Didn't make a lot of sense, but
Yeah.
I guess.
If you vote early,
Huh?
if you vote early, you don't have to
Yeah.
wait.
Yeah, I didn't have to wait, except I didn't know what precinct I was in.
Yeah. You know, there's stormwater, there's, you know, I'm just trying to think of the things this year. You know, there's the first floor, there's stormwater, which is another big deal. I know some people don't want to listen to it, but, you know, we'll be doing PR around that because there's a new bill coming. It should capture people's attention, but it hasn't yet.
When is stormwater on the bill for the first time?
July.
It's coming
Yeah.
July.
We're still working with the consultants to work out the utility and the billing and all that stuff. So it may be, eventually, hopefully it'll be baked into the water sewer trash bill, but, you know, this year, a couple years, it may be one bill, you know, in the winter, to get the ball rolling, but,
That one would be really interesting, I think, because I'm trying to think back to when we last met on it. It was like, there was all those exclusions, right, depending on like if you had like, I don't know if any, I'm sure that's changed. Now that we're
Credits.
actually getting closer to it, yeah.
and the credits.
And Brutus is always a good show.
Just don't tell them.
Do we have specifics for the school committee in December? Like, are they looking to us to provide what we want to hear?
I think the more you can tell me
Okay.
what they want, the better it is, yeah.
Just redistricting is top of mind right now with everybody. And so just curious,
Yeah.
when we think about long-term financial plan with the schools, how is that getting considered when we're thinking about
Yeah.
redistricting? I think would be beneficial, just because if it's not being talked about extensively, it's probably going to kick off pretty soon amongst the community, so,
Yeah, yeah, I mean, that's a huge financial,
yeah.
has a huge financial impact, for sure. Anything else that folks want to, curiosity about the schools?
I think just overall how they're starting to plan, right, because we saw last year how their budget went up, and I'm making up numbers, say it was like their budget went up 15% and overall revenue growth was like 5%, and how, like, what are they doing to think about that and bridge that gap?
Yeah.
And of course, my curiosity is how come we can go from 6,400 students to 4,700
And still have that jump.
and still have that kind of, and I understand, you know, all of the, you gotta dues from the state and all that stuff, but that's a 25%, almost a 25% drop.
Yeah.
And the
That is-
budget has gone up every time,
Mhm.
significantly. That's
But is it a 25% drop in the
Stu-
things that cost a lot for the
I'm
budget?
just saying, students themselves, and
No,
there's
no,
a
no.
cost per student.
Yeah, but not every student has the same cost.
Oh, true, and that's what we'd like to
That'd be
hear,
part of it,
how you
yeah.
can.
That's what I'm trying to
still,
figure out.
If the businesses we were in had a drop of 25% in volume,
Mhm.
somebody would be looking for cuts, not rising costs. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Excellent questions.
Yeah. I'll be happy to make a graph that we can put up.
I think you should,
This-
George. I
this
think
way.
you should.
It looks like this.
I want to, maybe, and even we're on the record, so maybe they'll watch the tape. I think they're having a subcommittee upstairs. We can have Miriam's graphs next to your graphs, George, and we can compare graphs from the finance committee and the school business administrator.
Okay.
Any other topics of So we got stormwater, we got permitting and inspections and health,
Well-
comp and class.
You know, I guess, it is of personal interest, that police and fire have made major changes in how they operate, both of them. We've gone to the 4x10s in the police department, and the battalion chiefs and that whole thing. It'd be nice to get a quick overview of how did it go. Do the troops like it?
Yeah.
Is it working? Are there glitches? You know?
You will, and I'm not trying to dismiss that suggestion for a highlight, you know, or part of the Bill Dowd deep dive series. But I know that both of the chiefs are going to address that in their budget narrative for FY24 for sure. And I know because, you know, now we're back, to your point, we're through now multiple contract cycles with both unions. And in fact, both have taken out language, particularly like the police, there was a phase-in period, you know, of I think 36 months, if I remember correctly. You know, now it's been taken out as no more phase-in period. It is what it is, and I think that things like that are a good sign. My guess, what you're going to hear of from both of them, is that, in fact, I know it's not a guess. You know, they're feeling it, I think, at a staffing level that's quite significant. You know, when we look at local receipts, we're looking at fire ambulance receipts too, right? I mean, that's a part of local receipts, and I think when you see those numbers going up, it's telling you that not only, yeah, it's a revenue source and we can look at it on a revenue sheet, but that's call volume happening, and that's ambulance runs going to the hospital, that's staff that run those things, it's apparatus that has to do that. And if that's what the public's demanding, whether we like it or not, it's an emergency situation, however that happens. You know, I think they're both getting fairly close to just tapping out with what we have. So I think you're going to hear a pretty good message from them and I've said this to you guys before, the number one thing I hear of every single day is speeding. It's just the speeding, the aggressive driving, the tailgating, the cutting corners, the blowing off of lights and rules, you know, all of that stuff, whether, again, right or wrong, it's what I hear people are feeling the most, and that is probably the number one concern I hear of from citizens in the office. I know the chief gets a lot of it too. The council, you can't go a meeting without some sort of inquiry coming up about that issue. And the only way you can deal with it is, you know, signs don't work. I'm sorry to tell everybody this. It's heartbreaking that I have to tell us citizens often that signs don't work. They do a little bit, like on King Street, the slowdowns before Parmenter, but it's going to take traffic calming measures and infrastructure improvements, and ultimately it takes more professionals to be out on the streets. When people get tickets, that's when they start to realize things. So,
Classic example in staffing, the bad accident we had there.
Yeah.
We had no fire trucks and no ambulances available.
they were all on other calls.
They were all out at the time, which is really kind of,
Yeah. I think you're seeing, you know, back to the mental health clinician, I think you're seeing, you know, you're just seeing a very, very big spike in mental health related calls. And I think I don't think I need to tell anybody this, but whatever it is that's overwhelming people, I think the police and public safety infrastructure systems in all of our communities around here are feeling it very, very much. And I think that's why you're seeing, we hear this in other communities too. Why'd Franklin show up over here? Why are they here? How did Norwood get here faster than we did, right? That's what happened last week. And that's one of the reasons why. It's not because Norwood was here faster, it's because every apparatus between here and Norwood was already out on another call. So, you know, I think you're gonna hear that coming up over the next few months.
but the battalion chief was there and did his job.
And did a heck of a job.
And I mentioned to Alicia tonight, I think it's coming up in we had a Franklin Fire at a Norton football game?
She'll be here next Wednesday
Yeah,
if people
Becky,
want to.
somebody.
Yeah,
And,
so if you want to watch next week's council meeting, I don't want to give it all away, but you can tune in then, and, you know, it'll be the first thing on the agenda, so hopefully people will be happy. We got an amazing staff.
She saved a life is the point.
Yeah.
She and an athletic trainer.
Yep.
But enough of that. A motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor, aye?